Something remarkable is stirring, my brothers and my sisters. Something that the cameras do not show. Something that the headlines only whisper, but something that is shaking the very soil beneath the feet of Africa. From the dry winds of the Sahel to the crowded ports of West Africa, there is a storm rising. Not a storm of guns and bloodshed, but a storm of vision, of dignity, of sovereignty. For decades, Africa was told there was only one road to walk. Accept the loans, privatize the land, sell the soul of the nation piece by piece, and pray that prosperity might one day trickle down. The World Bank, the IMF, these names became like chains wrapped in the language of progress. But now that chain is being challenged, and leading this quiet rebellion, standing taller than glass towers and financial skyscrapers, is a man from one of the poorest nations on earth, yet rich in spirit. His name is Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. When the lenders came with their tempting package, he did not bow. He did not tremble. He looked his people in the eye and said, "No." Not with hesitation, not with apology, but with the calm certainty of a man who knows that dignity is worth more than dollars. This is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about a continent waking up, remembering its strength, reaching back to the memory of Sankara and choosing a different path. If you believe truth is greater than headlines, if you believe the story of Africa must be told in full, then subscribe now and walk with us on this journey. In the heart of West Africa, under the burning sun and the long shadow of colonial memory, a moment unfolded that sent ripples across an entire continent. It did not begin with an army marching. It did not begin with a coup or a riot in the streets. It began with a single word spoken from the lips of a young leader to the most powerful financial institutions in the world. No. The nation was Burkina Faso, a land often dismissed by analysts as one of the poorest, one of the weakest, a nation forgotten on maps except when tragedy strikes. Yet in that place, history was being rewritten. For years, the promise of development had come wrapped in the glossy packages of international lenders. Roads, schools, electricity, the language was sweet, but the fine print carried the same poison: privatization of the nation's assets, elimination of subsidies for farmers, higher costs of food and fuel for the poor, the dismantling of state capacity in the name of efficiency. And so the lenders came again, this time with what they called a roadmap to modernization, a lucrative package. Money for infrastructure, money for reserves, money to unlock doors that had long been shut. But this time, the answer was different. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, not as a supplicant, not as a servant of outside powers, but as a son of the soil. He looked at the future being offered, and he recognized the chains hidden inside. And with a steady voice, he said, "We will not sell tomorrow for a handful of dollars today." That decision did not come in a moment of impulse. It was not reckless defiance. It was the harvest of years of frustration, of watching how every loan signed in golden halls left the people in wooden shacks, years of realizing that each so-called reform hollowed out the nation's strength, years of seeing prosperity promised but never delivered. And the people understood. For too long, decisions had been made in Washington boardrooms and European ministries, and then handed down like commandments. But on that day, something shifted. A government finally said, "We choose our own path." It was a declaration that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a sacrifice. The echoes of Thomas Sankara could be heard in that moment. Sankara, the man who renamed Upper Volta into Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Sankara, who planted trees, who banned luxury for ministers, who made the nation feed itself. Sankara, who told his people, "He who feeds you controls you," and who paid for his conviction with his life. Now, decades later, another Burkinabe leader stood in the same tradition, carrying the same fire, but speaking it to the 21st century. This was not merely economic. It was political. It was philosophical. It was a refusal to continue bowing before the altar of dependency. And though the decision was local, its significance was continental. Because when one small nation dares to defy the World Bank, when one young leader dares to lift his head, it sends a message far beyond its borders. Africa remembers. And yet, my friends, as the words settled into the dust of Ouagadougou, the questions began to rise like smoke into the sky. How would the lenders respond? How would the global powers react when their authority was challenged, not with violence, but with vision? The decision was clear. The conviction was firm. But the story was only beginning. For what happens when a nation says no to the masters of finance? Does the world respect such courage, or does it strike back with all its might? Stay with me, for the answer is unfolding even now. When the announcement was made in Ouagadougou, when the young captain turned president stood before his people and rejected the golden offer of international lenders, the earth trembled. Not because of guns, not because of explosions, but because of the silence that followed, a silence heavy enough to be heard across continents. And then came the storm. Within days, Western media outlets filled their screens with warnings. Experts in suits, many of whom had never set foot in Africa, leaned forward on television panels and declared the decision reckless, naive, even dangerous. Headlines painted Burkina Faso as unstable, irrational, a nation gambling with its future. The message was clear: you cannot defy the system and survive. But while the voices of condemnation rose in New York and London, a different song began to play in Bamako, in Addis Ababa, in Lagos, in Johannesburg. Across Africa, young people gathered in classrooms and on street corners, whispering the name Ibrahim Traoré as though it were a spark in dry grass. On Pan-African networks, in blogs and forums, the rejection of the loan was celebrated not as isolation, but as liberation. For the first time in years, a leader had not only spoken of independence, but acted upon it. The reaction was emotional, almost spiritual. To many Africans weary of broken promises and endless debts, Traoré's defiance felt like an exodus from bondage. The old narrative, that progress could only come from obedience to creditors, was cracking. A new story was being written, one where sovereignty was no longer a dream, but a choice. And in that crack of history, old memories awakened. The face of Thomas Sankara appeared on murals. His words, "The hand that feeds you controls you," were quoted in classrooms and shared on social media. His legacy, once buried beneath the rubble of assassinations and betrayals, now burned with new fire. It was as if the past was reaching out to bless the present, as if Sankara himself had risen to say, "I told you this day would come." But the institutions Traoré defied were not accustomed to silence. Statements came from international offices, cautious at first, then sharper, reminding the world of Burkina Faso's fragility, hinting at the dangers of defiance. Aid agencies murmured of suspensions. Investors whispered of risks. The machinery of pressure, subtle yet relentless, began to turn. Yet for every headline of doom, there was another headline of hope, written not in newspapers, but on the walls of African streets. Murals painted with fists raised high, songs sung by students about sovereignty. Community meetings where farmers spoke of feeding themselves without foreign dictation. The people were no longer passive. They were participants in a drama larger than any one leader, larger than any one nation. The divide grew clear. In the West, the act was framed as chaos. In Africa, it was framed as courage. And somewhere between the two, the world began to wonder, could this be the spark of a wider rebellion against dependency? The reaction was not only political, it was deeply personal. For young Africans especially, the moment redefined what leadership could mean. No longer was leadership measured by eloquent speeches or empty promises. Now it was measured by the courage to stand against giants, by the willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term dignity. And so the name Traoré became more than a headline. It became a symbol, a whisper of possibility, a sign that the tide might finally be turning. But symbols are fragile, and institutions as vast as global finance do not yield easily. In the corridors of power, questions began to rise. Would Burkina Faso survive without the handouts? Would sanctions, direct or indirect, follow? Would other nations be emboldened, or would they be scared into silence? The world was watching. Africa was holding its breath. For when courage meets power, when dignity challenges dominance, something must give. But will it be the chains of dependency that break, or the fragile hope of a continent daring to dream? The dust of that decision did not settle quietly. It rolled through the streets of Ouagadougou, through the fields where farmers bent over dry earth, through the classrooms where young men and women dreamed of tomorrow. For the first time in years, ordinary people felt that their government was speaking with their voice, not with the voice of distant creditors. There were consequences. Oh yes, there were. Aid programs slowed. International NGOs raised alarms. Critics warned of inflation, of shortages, of isolation from global markets. Some officials trembled at the thought of empty treasuries and rising prices. But alongside that anxiety, another seed began to grow, a seed of ownership, of pride, of belief that destiny could be shaped by African hands. Community leaders gathered in open forums not to discuss what Washington or Brussels would permit, but to imagine what Burkina Faso could build for itself. University students debated models of local development, asking how to harness the nation's resources for its people. Street artists painted walls with bold colors, declaring independence not only in politics, but in spirit. The rejection of the loan was more than policy. It was a spark, igniting a new consciousness. And it was not contained within Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, civil society groups demanded audits of foreign loans. In Ethiopia, where defiance of outside interference runs deep, Traoré's move was celebrated as validation. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, leaders began to re-examine contracts with foreign mining companies, asking aloud, why does wealth leave while poverty stays? In Senegal, economists pushed harder for regional trade within Africa, arguing that when neighbors trade with neighbors, value circulates at home instead of flowing out. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, once seen as paperwork and speeches, suddenly felt urgent, necessary, alive. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract word for politicians. It became a daily conversation in homes, markets, and on radio shows. And women, those who had long carried the heaviest burdens of austerity, stepped to the forefront. Across Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, they organized cooperatives that rejected the old microfinance traps of debt upon debt. Instead, they built systems of collective ownership, rooted in family, in community, in resilience. They demanded that development serve mothers and children, not foreign investors. Their voices rose with a clarity that could not be ignored. Dignity begins at home. In the cities, technology hubs buzzed with a new spirit. Young coders in Lagos, Kigali, Nairobi began asking how innovation could serve sovereignty. They built mobile banking systems for the unbanked, solar grids for the powerless, agricultural platforms for rural farmers. They proved that independence did not mean retreating into isolation. It meant creating solutions that fit African realities rather than importing expensive systems from abroad. But perhaps the greatest change was not in policies or programs, but in psychology. A generation that had grown up believing there was no choice but dependency suddenly saw another path. Leadership was redefined, not as submission to creditors, not as eloquent begging at global summits, but as the courage to say no when no was needed. This shift unsettled the comfortable order of the world. If Burkina Faso could dare, who would be next? If one small nation could spark such pride, what would happen when others followed? And yet, the risks were real. Aid might shrink. Investments might dry up. Sanctions, subtle or open, could fall like shadows. The road ahead was not smooth, but conviction burned brighter than comfort, and among the people there was a sense that this moment was worth the pain. The old illusion that Africa must always ask for permission was shattered, and in its place, a new narrative was rising, a narrative of sovereignty, of resilience, of self-determination. But what do you believe, my brothers and sisters? Is true independence worth the price of hardship? Or will fear once again silence the dream? Let me know in the comments, for your voice is part of this story. From Washington to Brussels, from London to Paris, the decision of a small West African nation rang louder than expected. For decades, the global order assumed Africa would never dare to defy. Loans and aid were not just economic tools. They were instruments of influence, levers of control, threads in a web that kept the continent within reach. When Burkina Faso said no, it was not only refusing money. It was refusing the unspoken assumption that Africa must always bow its head before asking permission. That refusal unsettled the halls of power. Analysts in the West were quick to label the act reckless, even dangerous. They warned of collapse, instability, chaos. But beneath their words, another fear stirred, a fear that if one African nation could walk away, others might follow. And if others followed, the carefully managed balance of power would begin to unravel. History offers its own indictment. Nations like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore did not rise by following the prescriptions of global creditors. They shielded their industries, guided their economies, used the state as an instrument of development. They did the opposite of what Africa was told to do, and they prospered. African intellectuals now ask the hard question: why were we told to privatize, to liberalize, to dismantle our governments, while others were allowed to build? And in America, the dilemma grows sharper. If the United States truly believes in democracy and freedom, it must also accept the freedom of nations to chart their own course, even when that course rejects Washington's model. If it clings to paternalism, Africa will look elsewhere. If it chooses respect, partnership may yet bloom. The new African consensus is not anti-American. It is anti-subjugation. The call is simple. Treat us as partners, not as pupils. Honor our sovereignty, not just in words, but in deeds. But will America hear it? Will Europe hear it? Or will the old reflex return to punish, to pressure, to preserve the illusion of control? The answer to that question will not only shape Africa's tomorrow, it will reveal the soul of the West itself. Which path will it choose? The road ahead is not smooth, my brothers and my sisters. It is narrow, it is rocky, and it is costly. To walk away from dependency is to walk into uncertainty. Aid may shrink. Investments may hesitate. Sanctions, quiet or loud, may come knocking. The world does not easily release its grip on those it has long held. And yet, the vision is brighter than the fear. For across Africa, a new generation is rising. Young men and women, children of the digital age, no longer waiting for permission. In the tech hubs of Lagos and Kigali, in the universities of Accra and Nairobi, they are building solutions for African problems. Local banking for the unbanked, solar power for villages forgotten by the grid, new ways of farming for soils long exploited. They are proving that sovereignty is not isolation but innovation. Women, too, are stepping to the front lines. For too long, they have carried the heaviest burdens of austerity, feeding families when food prices soared, holding communities together when subsidies were cut. Now they demand that development honor their labor, their wisdom, their resilience. They are forming cooperatives, owning land, leading initiatives that put families before financiers. Their voices echo a timeless truth. A nation cannot rise while its mothers are silenced. The diaspora scattered across continents is awakening to this call as well. From Atlanta to London, from Paris to Toronto, Africans abroad are beginning to see their remittances not as lifelines of survival, but as seeds of investment, as contributions to a future free from dependency. And at the heart of the continent, regional cooperation is taking new life. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, once dismissed as bureaucracy, now feels urgent, necessary. For when Africans trade with Africans, the wealth of the land circulates among its people. Yes, the risks are real. Yes, the journey is long. But the spirit has shifted. No longer is the question, can Africa survive without permission? The question now is, can Africa truly live while remaining in chains? The choice stands before us all, fear or freedom, comfort or conviction. But which will Africa choose? And which will the world allow? The answer lies in the days to come. Africa is not waiting any longer. Africa is not asking permission. Africa is not rising. It has risen. From the red earth of the Sahel to the green valleys of the Congo, a new voice is declaring itself. A voice of dignity, a voice of sovereignty, a voice that says, we will no longer be defined by the debts of others, but by the dreams of our own. The decision of Ibrahim Traoré was more than politics. It was prophecy. It was a signal flare shot into the night sky, telling the world that the silence of submission is over. And though the World Bank may continue to offer its golden packages, though critics may continue to predict collapse, the people of Africa have tasted the sweetness of saying no. That taste will not be forgotten. The road ahead is uncertain, yes. The costs will be real, yes. But for the first time in generations, the ground seems to be moving in Africa's favor. The old chains of dependency are cracking. The new foundations of sovereignty are being laid. And the question is no longer whether the World Bank will approve, but whether Africans themselves will endure, sacrifice, and build a freedom that no institution can buy. So I ask you, my brothers and my sisters, do you believe this moment marks the dawn of a new era? Or do you fear the storm will pass, leaving the old system intact? Should leaders like Ibrahim Traoré continue this struggle alone, or must a whole generation rise to stand beside him? If you believe dignity is worth more than dollars, share this message. If you believe Africa deserves its own tomorrow, subscribe today. The revolution will not be televised, but it can be amplified through your voice, your witness, your conviction, because history will remember those who saw clearly before the world caught up. And when Africa stands tall, let it be said, we were not bystanders. We were witnesses. We were part of the rising.